I'm Delilah, and tonight, like most nights since I arrived in Monte Carlo, I found myself sitting alone at a small cafe by the bustling casino square. It's a long way from the lavish life I was born into, but after graduating from a prestigious college in New York, I crave something simple, something real. My dad owns what feels like half the world, from luxury hotels to cutting-edge tech firms. But I use my mom's last name, keeping a little distance from the glittering world that comes with my father's empire. It's my way of staying grounded and keeping the spotlight at bay. The evening air was turning cooler when he walked in. Julian looked like he belonged here, or at least he acted like he did. He moved with the kind of confidence that only comes from wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Without asking, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "Mind if I join you?" he said, though he'd already made himself comfortable. I barely glanced up from my coffee. "Looks like you're already sitting," I replied coolly. He laughed, a smooth sound that seemed rehearsed. "I'm Julian, and you are?" "Delilah," I said, giving him a brief look. He wasn't my usual type, too polished, too perfect, but I had to admit he was good-looking. "So, Delilah," he continued, "what brings someone like you to a place like this? All alone?" His tone was teasing, and I couldn't decide whether I was irritated or entertained. "Just enjoying my coffee," I said vaguely, not wanting to get into specifics. "And you?" I asked, turning the question back on him. He shrugged. "I could say business, but I'd be lying. Tonight, let's just say I'm here looking for something interesting." "Looks like I might have found it." His eyes held mine steady and confident. I raised an eyebrow. "Hope the coffee lives up to your expectations." Then he smiled, his gaze not leaving mine. "Something tells me it already has." I wasn't here to make friends, and I definitely wasn't interested in a fling. "Look, I'm not one of those girls who falls for lines. If that's what you're after, you're wasting your time," I said, firm and clear. Julian leaned back in his chair, a genuine look of amusement crossing his face. "Who says I'm playing a game?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. "Experience," I replied bluntly. "You sit down uninvited, drop a line. What? Expect a phone number or a date." He chuckled, looking like he was enjoying the challenge. "You're tough. I like that. I'm not looking for a number, just a conversation. But if it's too much, just say the word and I'll disappear." I paused, considering him for a moment. Monte Carlo was beautiful, but it could be lonely too. Maybe a little chat wouldn't hurt. "Conversation's fine," I said, "but keep it light." We talked for a while. To my surprise, it was easy. Julian didn't try to impress me with stories of wealth or connections, which was rare. There was something about him that suggested he was used to the finer things in life, but they didn't define him. As the evening wore on, I realized I was actually enjoying the conversation. Eventually, the night began to wind down, and it was time to go. "Well, Julian," I said as I stood up, "this was unexpectedly pleasant." He grinned, clearly enjoying my surprise. "Surprised yourself, huh?" "Maybe just a little," I admitted. "Good night, Delilah," he said with a nod. "Good night, Julian," I replied, feeling a strange sense of curiosity about this man who seemed to defy expectations. I made my way back to my apartment, the echoes of Julian's words still lingering in my mind. Monte Carlo was certainly full of surprises, and perhaps, just perhaps, I had found one tonight. After meeting Julian, the nights here no longer felt as solitary. He had this way of showing up wherever I was, whether I was wandering through the local markets during the day or dining alone in the evening. Julian was always there. His persistence wasn't annoying. Surprisingly, it was quite the opposite. It was as if he genuinely wanted to be around me without being overbearing. One evening, as I watched the sun sink below the horizon, a soft breeze in the air, Julian appeared again. He walked over with 3 coffees in hand and sat down next to me without saying a word. I raised an eyebrow playfully, assuming he knew I'd want one. "If I'm wrong, I'll drink both," he said, handing me a cup. I smiled. "Good guess," I replied, taking the coffee from him. We sat together in comfortable silence, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. After a while, Julian finally broke the quiet. "You never told me. What do you do back in the States?" he asked. I shrugged. I didn't think it mattered. "Right now, I'm just enjoying not working," I replied. He chuckled. "Fair enough, but I think everyone has a story, don't you?" In the days that followed, we fell into a comfortable rhythm. Julian showed me parts of Monte Carlo I hadn't seen yet, and we talked about everything and nothing. Movies, books, our favorite foods. He loved to argue about the best James Bond actor, always defending Daniel Craig, while I was a firm believer in the classics. Sean Connery all the way. One afternoon, as we walked along the beach, Julian suddenly stopped, his expression serious in a way I hadn't seen before. "Delilah," he said, his tone more earnest than usual. "I know I'm just some guy you met at a cafe, but these past weeks have been, I don't know, different, better because of you." I stopped too, unsure of how to respond. Feelings were the last thing I planned on dealing with here. "Julian," I said slowly, "I like hanging out with you. I really do, but this is just a break for me. I'm not looking for complications." He nodded, taking a deep breath, his expression softening. "I get it. No pressure. Just know I'm here, okay? And I think you're pretty amazing." Days turned into weeks, and my time in Monte Carlo was coming to an end. Julian and I spent more and more time together, and what started as casual strolls and conversations turned into late-night dinners and early morning breakfasts. It was the last thing I expected, falling for someone under the Mediterranean stars. Then one evening, just as the night was falling, Julian dropped a bombshell. "Come back with me, Delilah," he said, his voice full of hope. "Work at my company in the States. I know it's sudden, but I don't know. I just think it could be great." The idea was crazy, completely insane, and yet a part of me couldn't help but feel tempted by the adventure, by the idea of taking this, whatever this was, and seeing where it could lead. Moving back to the States would be like stepping into an alternate universe. Julian's offer wasn't just a job, it was an invitation into his life. Suddenly, I imagined myself living in an ordinary apartment in a quiet town, playing the role of an ordinary girl who had somehow gotten lucky. But my father had other ideas about what was ordinary. He showed up unannounced one afternoon just as everything seemed to be shifting. I was unpacking my last box when the deep sound of my dad's laughter echoed through the room. He stood in the doorway, a giant in the frame, his presence filling the space like he always did. "Well, well, Delilah, hiding out in plain sight, huh?" He chuckled, wrapping me in a hug so tight it almost knocked the air out of me. "So tell me about this decision. This guy must be something special for you to pick up and move like this." His tone was light, but I knew better. He was doing his fatherly duty, trying to figure out if there was any trouble hiding beneath the surface. I sat down on the couch and sighed, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "His name's Julian, and he's different, Dad. He doesn't know about all of this." I waved my hand vaguely, motioning to the opulence of the apartment, the wealth, the lifestyle, and all the hidden strings that came with it. Dad sat beside me, his expression turning serious. "Delilah, you know you can't keep that a secret forever. If he's going to be a part of your life, he deserves to know who you really are. I know, Dad, I answered quietly. I want to be sure about him before I complicate things anymore. Thanks for looking out for me, though. He ruffled my hair, a gesture that made me feel like a kid again. Always, kiddo. Just remember, if you ever need anything, I'm just a call away. And I've got eyes everywhere, he added with a wink. The next few weeks passed in a blur, adjusting to my new job, settling into my new life, and Julian being a constant presence. He was as supportive and charming as ever, but there was an intensity about him now, a sharpness that came with the weight of the responsibilities he carried. One evening, during a quiet dinner at my place, Julian brought up something I had been dreading, the topic I hadn't been ready to face. "Delilah, when do you think I'll get to meet your parents?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "I feel like I'm missing a big part of your life." I paused, the words hanging in the air. I didn't know how to explain the truth, the whole messy reality. Well, I started slowly. My mom passed away a long time ago, and my dad, well, he's just a regular trucker. We're not exactly on speaking terms right now. Julian frowned, a hint of concern crossing his face. "I'm sorry to hear that, but whenever you're ready, I'd like to meet him. Family is important." I nodded, grateful for his understanding, even if I wasn't sure how I would ever bridge the gap between Julian and my father. My dad's world was one I wasn't ready to introduce to him. Not yet. As time passed, life with Julian moved at a pace I hadn't expected. We were blending our lives together seamlessly. My new job at his company was going well, and our relationship seemed to be growing deeper with each passing day. It felt like we were gearing up for something big, but I didn't realize just how big until that moment actually arrived. It was a regular evening at his apartment, cozy, upscale, with a view of the city skyline. We had just finished dinner. Nothing fancy, just some takeout since neither of us felt like cooking. We were sitting on the couch, a documentary about ocean life playing softly in the background, the kind of show you watch but don't really pay attention to. Suddenly, Julian turned toward me, his expression far too serious for the moment. He took my hand, and in that instant, my heart started to race. "Delilah," he began, his voice steady, but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything we've been through, and everything I want for us in the future." I nodded, my mouth dry as I waited for him to continue. "I love you, Delilah," he said, his words sincere and filled with emotion. "I love everything about you, and I don't want to imagine my life without you." He paused, and I could see the nervousness in his eyes. It was a vulnerability I hadn't expected, but it made me feel a little less afraid. "I want to be with you always. Will you marry me?" Just like that, without a ring or a grand gesture. It was simple, genuine, and unmistakably Julian. The word yes came rushing out of me, almost in a sigh of relief. "Yes, yes, I will." Julian's grin, wide and infectious, spread across his face, and he pulled me into a tight hug. The rest of the evening passed in a whirlwind of excitement and future plans, talking about what we wanted and where we saw ourselves. It was thrilling and a little daunting, but it felt so right. The next hurdle came when I had to tell my dad. I expected him to be happy, but his reaction wasn't what I'd hoped for. It was lukewarm, almost cautious. "Delilah, you know I want nothing but your happiness," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "But are you sure about this? It's all happening so fast." "I'm sure, Dad. He's a great guy, you'll see." I tried to sound more confident than I felt. He sighed, his eyes searching mine. "All right, but promise me one thing." I had to sign a prenuptial agreement just to be safe. The word prenuptial didn't intimidate me. It was simply part of the modern marriage package, especially when you're marrying someone who has as much to lose as I did, even if Julian didn't fully understand the extent of it. Of course, Dad. We'll handle it, I reassured him. That's good, he replied. Then he added, and Delilah, I won't be at the wedding. I don't want to spoil your story about being a simple girl. The next moment was when I met Julian's mother. Her reception was cold from the very beginning. At dinner in their family home, she gave me a look that could freeze a room. Julian, are you sure about this girl? She asked bluntly. She doesn't seem like she's a good fit for our family. Julian tried to smooth things over, but his mother was relentless. A prenuptial agreement is non-negotiable, she declared. I nodded without hesitation. I knew agreeing to it would ease some of the tension. Absolutely, I wouldn't have it any other way, I said. Later, we sat down with a lawyer and formalized everything. Despite these initial challenges, our wedding in the Maldives was stunning. Standing beside Julian with the ocean gently lapping against the shore and the sand beneath our feet, I felt a surge of hope. It felt like it was just the two of us, our love, and a future that we were ready to shape together. The rocky start with our families didn't matter anymore. Life as a married couple began much better than I had imagined. Julian and I settled into our new house, a beautiful place with far more space than we would ever need. It was meant to be the start of our perfect life together. I threw myself back into work, determined to prove that I was more than just the boss's wife. My role at the company had always been challenging, but now with the added layer of expectations, it felt like a whole new level. I wasn't just managing projects anymore. I was part of the decision-making process. Julian seemed proud of me, at least at first. He would introduce me in meetings with a hint of pride in his voice. Asterisk, this is Delilah, my wife and our program manager. Asterisk, but as the months went by and my projects continued to succeed, bringing in significant profits and boosting the company's reputation, something started to shift in Julian. It was subtle at first, a comment here, a remark there. One evening as we sat down for dinner, he brought it up. Delilah, you're doing great at work. Maybe too great, he said. I looked up from my plate, confused. What do you mean, too great? Isn't that good for the company? It is, he admitted, pushing his food around. But you know, the guys are starting to say it's turning into the asterisk, Delilah show asterisk over there. His words stung a little. Isn't that a bit unfair? I thought you'd be happy that we're doing well. I am happy, he said, though he didn't sound it. But it's just a lot. Everyone's always talking about you, how you handle things, and it makes me wonder where I stand. That conversation marked the beginning of a shift in our relationship. As the business grew, so did the tension between us. Julian's once supportive attitude began to feel tainted with jealousy and resentment. I couldn't understand it. Wasn't he the one who had encouraged me to step up in the first place? Things only seemed to get worse from there. When Julian's mother came to stay with us for a few weeks, her presence brought with it a traditional mindset that I had always managed to avoid. She would casually make remarks about my work, suggesting that a wife's place should be more focused on the home. You're always at the office, Delilah. When do you have time to care for your husband? She would ask. I tried to brush it off, hoping to keep the peace, but her comments only added to the growing distance between Julian and me. No matter how successful I was at work, it seemed nothing could repair the slow unraveling of our marriage. The more I achieved professionally, the more strained our relationship became. One evening, Julian came home from work with a stern expression, his face set in an unreadable line. Delilah, I think it's best if you leave the company, he said bluntly. We need to focus on our family, and it seems like your role there is just causing too much tension. His words cut through me. Leave the company. But why? I've been contributing so much. My voice trembled with disbelief and frustration. It's for the best, he replied coldly. You can focus on the house now. Maybe start that garden you've always wanted. His tone was dismissive, as though he were talking about something trivial, not my career. The next day, I discovered that he had fired all our house staff, the housekeepers, cooks, and horticulturists. It's all on you now, he said, almost as if he were punishing me. You wanted to be more involved at home. Well, home, here's your chance. His words were harsh, and though I wasn't afraid of housework, the way this was thrown at me felt deeply unfair. This wasn't the loving, supportive man I had married. This was someone controlling and intolerant, and I wasn't sure who he had become. His mother, staying with us at the time, seemed to enjoy the situation. It's good for a wife to focus on her home, she would say, her smile barely concealing her smirk whenever Julian talked about my new role as a full-time housewife. As I tried to adjust to this unexpected turn in my life, I couldn't help but feel a sense of shame. I was ashamed that I hadn't seen this coming, ashamed to admit that maybe my father had been right about Julian all along. When Julian suggested a trip to Monte Carlo to try to rekindle what little was left of our relationship, I felt hesitant yet still hopeful. That hope was quickly shattered when his mother announced she would be coming along. It's been ages since I've traveled, she declared, as if it were a command that couldn't be questioned. Julian, of course, welcomed her with open arms, not once considering what I might think or feel about it. We rented a small house in Monte Carlo, charming but expensive. What was meant to be a retreat quickly turned into a prison. From the moment we arrived, Julian and his mother treated the city like their personal playground. They rented expensive cars, visited exclusive boutiques, and dined at the finest restaurants, while I was left feeling more like an outsider in my own life. Meanwhile, I was left behind to manage the household, preparing meals for them and cleaning up after their excursions. They demanded home-cooked meals, turning me into nothing more than a servant in a holiday home. I was trapped, cooking and cleaning while they enjoyed themselves. As the days went by, Julian's mother's comments became sharper, more cutting. Really, Delilah, living at someone else's expense must be quite the life, huh? She would sneer, her words a slap disguised as a smirk. Julian never came to my defense. Instead, he laughed at her remarks, and each time, his laughter felt like a betrayal. It echoed through the cold walls of our temporary home, and with each laugh, the bond between us seemed to break a little more. I had always felt like an outsider in the city, its shine dimmed by the cold judgment of those around me. One evening, as we walked past a grand, old-fashioned hotel, its stately facade stood as a symbol of a world full of grace and admiration, a world I could never quite belong to. Julian's mother, her voice dripping with envy, remarked loudly, "Lucky billionaire Harris. Imagine owning a hotel like that, ruling over a palace of your own." Later that night, as we sat down at a restaurant overlooking the sea, my patience was finally worn thin. Julian's mother waved the waiter over with an air of superiority, dismissing me as if I were invisible. For Delilah, just the cheapest dish. No need to spoil her with luxuries she doesn't deserve, she declared, making sure her words carried to the nearby tables. Julian laughed and casually agreed, adding, "Good call, Mom. Let's not go overboard." Humiliation hit me like the waves crashing against the rocks below. I stood up abruptly, the sound of my chair scraping the floor echoing my inner turmoil. "I won't stand for this anymore," I said, my voice trembling but steady, louder than I meant. My hands shook, but I stood firm in my decision. I'm divorcing you, Julian. The cold air of Monte Carlo couldn't compare to the chill of betrayal I felt as I walked away from the restaurant. Instead of apologizing, Julian and his mother followed, hurling insults at me as I quickened my pace. His mother's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. Just look at her, a beggar, unworthy of my son. My heart pounded in my chest, but before I could escape, Julian caught up with me and grabbed my purse. His fingers tightened around it as he sneered. This is my money, Delilah. Go on, get out on all fours if you have to. His words cut deep, dripping with contempt. With a violent yank, he wrenched the purse from my shoulder, leaving me standing there, stunned and shaking. His mother's cruel laugh followed as she added, maybe now you'll learn to beg in Monte Carlo, since that's all you're good for. Their laughter echoed down the street, leaving me feeling small and alone. But just as their insults reached their peak, fate intervened. We had walked up to the very hotel Julian's mother had envied earlier, the one she had longed to own. With a sneer, she pointed to the hotel and said, maybe they'll let you in as a beggar. At that exact moment, the gates of the hotel opened and a guard appeared. He saw me, and his face lit up with recognition. Miss Harris, he called out, his tone warm and respectful as he walked toward me. He saluted. The air shifted in an instant. Julian and his mother froze, their expressions changing from satisfaction to confusion. The guard smiled broadly. Your father told us you might stop by. Please, this way. The best room is always reserved for you. As he spoke, Julian's mother's face turned pale, her earlier arrogance evaporating. She stammered Harris, as in billionaire Harris. Ignoring their stunned silence, I walked toward the guard. Every step was a quiet declaration of my independence. I straightened my posture and thanked Julian, my voice calm and controlled. Inside, a wave of relief and vindication washed over me. Behind me, Julian's voice cracked with desperation. Please, Delilah, he pleaded. I didn't mean. But his mother, not to be outdone, shouted over him. Perhaps we could come in for a drink, at least. I didn't even glance back as I stepped into the hotel. The heavy doors closing behind me felt like a powerful symbol, shutting out the turmoil of my old life. Julian led me to the reception, where the staff greeted me with the respect due to the daughter of their employer. The flight back to the United States felt endless, giving me plenty of time to think about what was next. By the time I landed, my resolve was as solid as the city sidewalks, ready to be walked upon yet unwavering in the face of pressure. The following day, I sat in the office of a renowned lawyer. He spread papers across the table before me like a strategist planning his next move. It seems, he said, his voice a mix of surprise and disbelief, that during your time with the company, your husband failed to pay you bonuses for the multi-million-dollar deals you closed. That sounds about right, I replied, my mind replaying the countless hours I had devoted to the company, all the successes I had driven, all the late nights, and all the sacrifices. We were filing for $7 million. The courtroom felt cold and impersonal, a sharp contrast to the fiery glares Julian shot my way as he fumbled through his defense. The man I had once loved now appeared small and insignificant. When the verdict was read, a resounding victory in my favor, awarding me $7 million, Julian's face crumpled with defeat. Outside the courthouse, he tried one last time to plead his case. Delilah, everyone's laughing at me, he said, his voice weak. I messed up. Can we start over? His words could have pulled at my heartstrings once, but not anymore. The woman I had become was no longer moved by his empty promises. You only missed the money, Julian, I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the cool air. Maybe you should listen less to your mother next time. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away. The sound of my heels echoed against the pavement. That was the final chapter. Back home, I faced my father. The silence between us was heavy, filled with words left unsaid. Finally, I broke the quiet. "Dad, I should have listened to you." He wrapped me in a warm embrace, his words full of understanding. "You've had to learn on your own. Now you know, and knowing is half the battle." We talked late into the night about life, mistakes, and new beginnings. His advice became a guiding light as I worked through my thoughts about the future. Inspired by our conversation, I began laying the groundwork for my next venture. The skills I had honed at Julian's company, combined with the significant settlement I had received, gave me the resources to start something meaningful, something that was mine. Weeks turned into months as I built my business from the ground up. The journey was full of challenges, but each setback taught me something valuable, and each success confirmed that I was on the right path. Sitting in my new office, looking out at the busy streets below, I realized just how far I had come. I had gone from being a disillusioned wife in a loveless marriage to a confident business owner. The road had been difficult, but every obstacle had only made me stronger.